Welcome back, Michael Coren Show. Censorship, human rights commissions, and again, making the point here that human rights commissions do a great deal of good work, but every time maybe a person with a disability is told you can actually live in that house, they can't stop you. That doesn't make the headlines, but these are important issues of censorship. And I want to ask you, Mike, because we mentioned things you can't say. I've said a few things in my time on this show, in print. I'm a social conservative. I have great reservations about Islam. I've tried to be careful and balanced. There are people who will attack me, but touch wood, up to now, no one has taken me to a Human Rights Commission. I would even go far as to say I'm one of the more outspoken social conservatives on issues of sexuality and life, and as a Christian, I've spoken about Islam. If you do bring balance into the debate, though, does that not satisfy any Human Rights Commission? Does that make it impossible for someone to attack you?
Well, I don't think so, but I want to speak to why I think sometimes people like yourself might not be touched by a Human Rights Commission. And I think this is one of the unfortunate sides to it, is that I think that these commissions in some cases may be using some strategy in who they go after in terms of the complaints they accept and they don't. Mm-hmm. We've seen several examples of people who, you know, aren't that well known. You know, like
Ezra Levant, Mark Stein.
Well, I mean, Ezra Levant was quite, you know, below the radar screen at the time, and I think that was probably a pretty bad tactical error on their part. And I think that you asked Noah what has really brought this into the forefront, and I think that it's quite clear that it was probably the Commission's accepting complaints against McLean's and then Ezra in short order after, which really brought this to the forefront. And I admit that I was completely ignorant to this issue previous to that happening. These were certainly the catalysts for myself coming to this issue. But I think that that's kind of sometimes the problem, is that these we haven't discussed this yet, but the complainants essentially have their prosecution paid for, which and we can talk about, you know, housing and employment issues, which I think is in many cases is justified. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes, you know, if you're working at McDonald's or something like that, I mean, McDonald's is a big corporation, you know, they can handle themselves. But well,
even it's one person with a house, if you say you can't live here because you're black, then there should be some sort of recourse.
Exactly, and I'm not going to sit here and debate that, because I don't think I've ever taken the position that people shouldn't have that recourse. But when it comes to issues of speech, like when you have some, you know, lowly pastor in Red Deer, Alberta, mm-hmm. Who, you know, I don't want to, you know, say that I support what he said, because I clearly don't. What he said was completely abhorrent. But somebody like himself doesn't have the financial means to fend off the state coming after him and forcing him to justify his views.
Do you believe all and any speech should be tolerated?
Well, no. I mean, there are limits on speech that I think that we can all accept. I think, you know, incitement to violence, you know, we have protections of copyright, mm-hmm. you know, like
libel and slander.
Libel and slander.
Can I give you a middle example? Because we may well all agree, if I said Mike Brock should be attacked, and that's against the law. If someone says an identifiable group, Jews are, and then makes a certain statement, does that not lead, in all likelihood, to some Jewish people being attacked? I mean, I'm not saying it's probable, but it does introduce the possibility that a Jewish person is attacked because someone has made a general comment that's very negative about Jews.
Well, I'm a libertarian, so I think that rights are inherently individual. I reject group rights, like this as a premise to my argument. I think that the potentiality for something to happen occurs in many of the individual rights that we have. I mean, we have freedom of movement. Certainly, if freedom of movement was more restricted, we might see less crimes against property and other things like that. I mean,
I was giving you a middle example. You've taken it to the extreme.
Well, I am taking it to an extreme because I think individual rights are very important. You know, if somebody says something like that, do I think that it's likely to cause violence? I hear people say racist things all the time, and here in Canada today, I don't think we're seeing the pattern of racial violence against individuals that would justify that we need to start combing through everybody's opinion with a fine-tooth comb and weeding out these things that we consider contemptuous or hateful, because I don't think that the evidence is there that a suppression of individual liberties to that extent is going to have favorable outcomes. I would argue that long term it's going to have negative outcomes, because we're giving power to the government to involve itself in a very dangerous practice, and that is suppression of ideas and opinions, which can lead to very dire consequences. And we've seen this happen before. And we went to war 60 some odd years ago, and we fought for those liberties. And
well, I don't think we did. I think we went to war.
Well, in certain
we went to war for Poland and gave Poland to the Soviets, for goodness sake. But no, there is a moderation here, because again, the idea that every piece of speech, all expression is analysed, how can we prosecute, that isn't happening. Some of these cases, I think, are bizarre and grotesque.
There's a danger, though.
But is there behind them, though, a noble desire to eliminate some of the lunacy in society that may, I'm not saying will, I was very careful in my words, but that may lead to violence?
No, I just don't accept that. I mean, I am sure, like, I'm not going to deny that words have meaning, that, you know, if somebody, you know, spreads a particular position, that it could, you know, spread, people could come to accept it, and it could eventually culminate in hate. But that's, you know, these are very long causal chains that we don't have a right to try and predict. In my opinion, I mean, I can't buy that. Like I said, I don't believe that there are group rights in our society to that extent, and I'm not going to accept that. And that's, see, because right now we're not discussing this on the same premise. The premise is not does speech have to have some sort of utility or value in order for it to be justified?
No, no one's arguing that.
You know,
you watch enough TV to know most speech has no value at all.
Exactly, and I think that right is inalienable. It is absolute up to the point of.
What about the right not to feel intimidated, offended, or frightened by what someone else says or does?
I'm sorry, I don't believe any such right exists, and I know that sounds.
So you're defining what a right is and who has it.
I am saying that, you know, I believe in a concept of myself, of self-ownership, you know, the sovereignty of my mind. And, you know, however those views are unpalatable to society or you or anyone else does not give you the right to tell me that that's an irresponsible opinion. That's irresponsible speech. If you say that, we're going to fine you, and if you don't pay the fine, we're going to throw you in jail or what have you. I mean, which is effectively. Last
question, and don't worry, I'm going to give them a hard time as well. If it can be a causal link between a statement, blacks are awful, we should do this, an attack on a black person, and the person who commits the attack said, well, I read this, and I went out and I beat up this black guy.
Well, let's use a real-world example of a similar case, and this would be David Ahenekue. Does anybody at this table think that the things that he said led to a favorable outcome to him? He was ostracized. I think Canadians were outraged by what he said. He was stripped of his Order of Canada. This is a man who was publicly discredited for what he did. And do we really need the government to take the next step?
Okay.
Which is
it wasn't the example I put to you. However, back in a few moments, we're going to hear from this side, if we're allowed to. We'll see you soon.